What's up, good people? Welcome to the Basketball Society podcast. I'm Martin Soaries. It's good to have you here on the show for this particular episode because we're doing something really special. I have organized my NBA team spectrum for the season. So I think I have 7 categories here that I've placed all 30 NBA teams in to give you a sense of my outlook of the NBA landscape this season. The NBA season obviously just tipped off this week, if you haven't noticed, and so we'll be here. Stay tapped in with the show. Subscribe wherever you're listening from. We're on YouTube and Apple Podcasts, and please leave a rating and review of the show on Apple Podcasts when you get a chance. I would really appreciate it. So let's tap in and talk some NBA team spectrum for this season. So this is the first time I've ever done this. We're going to keep updating this as we see fit throughout the season, as teams start to improve or fluctuate, improve or regress or whatever the case. We're going to keep updating the spectrum throughout the season. So we'll see if we get more or less contenders, if we have some more people, making some more noise and where teams change in categories. So it should be interesting. Of course, before we get started, make sure you follow Basketball Society on Instagram at Basketball Society _. You can follow me at martin.soaries. And of course, follow Basketball Society and subscribe on the YouTube channel. So NBA team spectrum, here we go. Let's start with, I'm going to start at the top and at the bottom just to get those out of the way, because I think those are the most kind of obvious. All right. So my contenders, which by contenders, we're talking championship contenders, right? I think there are 7: Nuggets, Lakers, Heat, Celtics, Suns, Bucks, Warriors. I'm not going to disrespect Steph Curry by not considering the Warriors as a championship contender, as long as he's there, healthy, and still Steph Curry, and he still has his running mates with him. And I still think they're going to be pretty good with Chris Paul. If Kuminga can step up, I think he's going to have to step up, and they've got to let him step up. Everyone else, again, self-explanatory: Phoenix, Boston, Lakers, Miami, Denver, Milwaukee. These are our 7 championship contenders to me. And we'll get into the other categories. There are some other teams that could have been in the championship contender category, but I have them in other categories, and I'll explain why as we get to them. So going to the bottom, I have 2 teams in the Doldrums. It's basically just the dead zone where you basically don't matter. There's nothing going on. And you're irrelevant. So I have 2 teams, the Charlotte Hornets and the Utah Jazz. I'm a big proponent for LaMelo Ball, and I'm really high on his talent and his ability, and I really feel strongly that he's going to deserve to play with better players. A player of his caliber deserves to play with better players at some point in his career. Not to say there aren't other good players on Charlotte. I think they do have other good players, but that organization is just struggling for relevance. And a player of LaMelo Ball's caliber, like, he could have been drafted to the Warriors. They went with James Wiseman, but LaMelo could have been running with the Warriors with Steph and Clay. I don't know how that would have looked, but I think that would have been pretty scary. But I feel like LaMelo deserves to play with good players better than him at some point in his career, and I think him and the league would be better for it, because I really feel like he's special. And Utah, I mean, they had Donovan Mitchell. They were relevant. They were going to the playoffs, but we haven't seen them as something to really watch and take seriously in some time. They've got Lauri Markkanen, good player, but when your lead guards are Talen Horton-Tucker and Jordan Clarkson, we know Utah is not going anywhere fast anytime soon. So those are the only 2 teams, the Hornets and the Jazz, that I feel are in the Doldrums. Let me name the one team I have as a fringe contender. I think the Kings, taking Golden State to Game 7 in the playoffs last year, which it seemed like they were kind of ready for, but then Golden State just kind of edged them out. Just more experience, just better in the moment in those pressure situations. But they were right there. And they've got Mike Brown, great coach. Their best players are young. They pretty much have the same group they had last year. So it's really on like De'Aaron Fox, Sabonis, Keegan Murray, Kevin Herter, like it's on those guys to just continue developing and use that experience to see if they can win the big one. But I almost see it as like the Kings of old, like with Mike Bibby and Doug Christie and them, like building up a really good team. Their only problem is going to be like there are other teams, like there may be one or two other teams that just end up being better than them or having one more star than them or just having a little bit more experience than them. And that is going to keep them from being like a legit championship contender. For a good amount of the season, Sacramento Kings were the number 1 seed. And I respect them as a good team, but as a championship contender, you've got if they got to the finals, if Sacramento made their way to the finals last year, I'd probably see them as a championship contender because they would have at least been there. And I'd say, okay, like now I expect them to be playing something closer to championship caliber basketball because they were there. I still see them as being on the fringe and like right on the edge of that. I can't put them quite in championship contender, but I'm not going to put them down into this next category, which is where I see teams that are playoff teams. Like I wouldn't pick any of these teams to win the title, but I think these are all teams that can bother championship teams. That's why I called this category competitive thorns. I usually say this about teams like these that I feel can bother championship teams. They maybe could beat some contenders in a series, but definitely during the regular season, you'll see teams like these scoring high amount of points, winning games that you may not think they would win because they have a lot of things working for them. They have good players, good talent, good depth. These are teams with a lot working for them. But they're not quite championship teams, but they can bother the championship teams. Competitive thorns: the Mavericks, the Thunder, the Pacers, the Cavaliers, and the Knicks. I feel like I could have had the Thunder as a fringe contender. Some people want the Thunder as a legitimate championship contender right now. And just for me and my criteria, I don't give a team championship contender unless you've at least one of your players has been there before. And OKC is still proving themselves. Now, I think OKC can have the kind of year that maybe Sacramento had last year. So OKC, maybe they could have made it into fringe contender. I could see them moving into fringe contender on this spectrum as the season goes on. But right now, I just see OKC as extremely dangerous. They've definitely got one of the most dynamic, complete starting fives in the league with Shea, Dort, Giddey, and both Jalen Williams. And now they've got Chet. There's a lot to like about OKC. I think they're like a fan favorite right now. I just see them more as a competitive thorn. Now, if they start the season like, 15-2 or, 18-1, if they get going, they could bump up all the way to a championship contender if I get to watch them enough and see what's all there. And if it's there, I could bump them right up to championship contender. I think they have that potential. Maybe just fringe contender, because again, I haven't seen Shea in the big games yet. I haven't seen Chet or Josh Giddey or any of these. I haven't seen them in that setting yet. So I struggle to give you any kind of real legitimate contention possibility when I just haven't seen you there yet. But if they look that good, I won't be shy about moving them up. Dallas, I think people are starting to warm up to the Luka and Kyrie duo. I thought it made sense just for the sake of giving Luka more help. Everybody was screaming and crying about Luka is playing hero ball. He needs more help. And then you get him a superstar level, right, playmaking, scoring guard who could take over the team at any point, Luka or no Luka, and people still want to complain just because it's Kyrie and the fit and there's only one basketball and all that nonsense. And so right now I have Dallas as a competitive thorn because they've got one of the top duos, not just one of the top backcourts, one of the top overall offensive duos in the league with Kyrie and Luka. So that's going to make them competitive against anybody. Dallas still needs a lot of work. Their roster is not a championship roster, but they have Kyrie and Luka, and a lot of teams don't even have that. So that is what keeps them as a competitive thorn against against anybody on any given night. The Pacers, I actually think the Pacers could be pretty good. They put up 143 in their season opener. I know it was against the Wizards, but everybody's not going to put up 140 against the Wizards every night this season. So, and I'm not saying the Pacers are going to average over 130 a game this season, but when you look at their depth, I love the fact that they picked up Bruce Brown. They snagged him from Denver. That's a huge pickup for them, in my opinion, and Obi Toppin. And I'm big on their rookie that they drafted, Jarace Walker, off the bench. Look out for him. To me, he looks like he could be another Draymond, but a little more athletic, little taller, little more dynamic and versatile. It looks like he might be able to shoot it a little bit. But he is super active. I could see him getting minutes pretty early for them, but I was watching him in summer league. He looks like the type that could really contribute NBA, good NBA minutes pretty early just because of his IQ and his activity. I think Indiana has a lot to work with in terms of their depth. They don't have any, superstar talent. I like Tyrese Halliburton a lot. He seems to only be getting better. They're one of those teams that has to do it by committee, and I think their committee has improved, and Indiana's going to be a sleeper. I think their depth is going to bother people. Benedict Mathurin, more and more people are going to learn how good he is in year 2. He's a sleeper talent for the Pacers that I think people are still learning like how good he actually is. They bring Buddy Hield off the bench. They've got the Nembhard kid now off the bench. Like, Indiana is pretty stacked just in terms of good quality basketball players on their roster. They might go 8+ deep with like quality players. So the Pacers, they're definitely a competitive thorn. They're not just gonna give the Wizards problems and hang 140 on them. They're gonna give good teams problems this season. The Cleveland Cavaliers, the biggest thing they could have done to me was pick up Max Strus because they were just so challenged shooting the 3 last season. I love Donovan Mitchell with them. I love their capability with the Donovan Mitchell. But they lost to the Knicks in a playoff series to me it was because the Knicks just had more offensive weapons that could do different things. And the Cavs, they do struggle. They're still not very deep, and it's not like Max Strus is going to shoot his way into making the Cavaliers a contender or a final, even a conference finals contender. But the Cavaliers did improve. I would have had them as a competitive thorn last year, just off the strength of having Donovan Mitchell. I'm definitely a big fan of Evan Mobley, Jared Allen. I love their front court, but they definitely need some more dynamic guard play and shooting. They addressed that a little bit with Max Strus, but they still have holes. But they've definitely improved. So I like Cleveland as a competitive thorn. The New York Knicks, they may be the biggest competitive thorn you can think of right now. And I just love that the Knicks are competitive. When the Knicks didn't get Donovan Mitchell, but they got Jalen Brunson, I'm like, guys, did you watch Jalen Brunson in Dallas? Did you see what he was doing in that playoff series against Utah? I was watching Jalen Brunson cut people up left and right and score at will. That's why that Dallas team went to the conference finals that year, because it wasn't just Luka, it was Jalen Brunson, it was Spencer Dinwiddie. That team got really hot, and a big part of it was Jalen Brunson. So he comes over to the Knicks. You've got this interesting to me, like lefty big 3 of Brunson, RJ Barrett, Julius Randle. And I like the Knicks depth. I love the Knicks depth. In fact, I love that they have your southpaw guards, Jalen Brunson, RJ Barrett. And then I love what the Knicks bring off the bench in their backcourt with Emmanuel Quickley and Quentin Grimes. Let me give you a quick stat. An amazing stat on Quentin Grimes. I got this from Tommy Beer on Twitter. Shout out to Tommy Beer. He's always doing a great job putting out great information on Twitter. The highest true shooting percentages among all guards who played at least 2,000 minutes. So true shooting percentage, if anyone doesn't know, only people who are into like stats and stuff. I'm not a huge advanced stats person at all. But I do like good stats and just looking at it when it's presented to me, but I'm not huge on it. But true shooting percentage, for anyone who doesn't know, is just one of the metrics. It's a metric that takes into account field goals, 3-pointers, and free throws. So it's really based on like the time you play and the shots you take and like the efficiency of that shooting percentage by combining threes, regular shots, and free throws. All right. So last season, the highest true shooting percentages among all guards that played at least 2,000 minutes. This was last season. Number one, Steph Curry, 65%. Number two, Dame Lillard, 64%. Number three, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, 62%. At number four, Quentin Grimes at 61%. The only guards after him were Donovan Mitchell and Kyrie Irving. The highest true shooting percentage among all guards last season, Quentin Grimes was in the top five. So that to me, that is a glaring stat to show you really just how impressive the Knicks roster is right now. It's definitely there for them. I just think Milwaukee and Boston and Miami all kind of clearly have the edge over them. I think New York, I'm going to do a podcast episode soon talking about the Knicks and what I see for them and what's possible, what might be next for them. People are floating out these trade scenarios. Joel Embiid, they kind of have the makings for kind of a blockbuster trade at some point. So it's really interesting. And the Knicks are in a really interesting, really promising position right now. But they are a competitive thorn if I've ever seen one, right? I think they can give any team's problems. I was even saying it last year with Jalen Brunson. I like the group they have. They're competitive. They've got pride. Like Jalen Brunson as their lead guard. I just from watching him at Villanova, knowing his makeup, his character, his culture as a basketball player is winning, toughness, all the things that you kind of think of when you want like New York Knicks, right? Basketball culture, the point guard for the New York Knicks. So I've been high on Jalen Brunson and the Knicks even last season. I love their potential. I don't see them as anything more than a competitive thorn right now. But they're in an interesting position to be a little bit more, depending on what happens in the near future. All right, next category is sneaky interesting. Usually my teams that I find like sneaky interesting are teams that are like low key deep, like they have players that are good. Like they clearly may not be that great. No one sees them as, some of these teams may not even be playoff teams. They're probably on the edge of being playoff teams. But I find these teams kind of sneaky interesting because of the kind of talent and players and in some cases depth that they have. So I've got Brooklyn, Portland, Detroit, Washington, and Orlando as my sneaky interesting teams. Brooklyn, because of really mainly the Ben Simmons story. He looks to be back in full form and wanting to play basketball again, which is a dope story. And people are saying great things about him on the team. Seeing him along with like Mikal Bridges as like their clear-cut best player, little more defined roles now in Brooklyn. They do have some interesting guard depth. They've got Spencer Dinwiddie back. They've got Lonnie Walker in there now and Dennis Smith. And they've got Cam Thomas as the ultimate wild card. He had 36 off the bench in their opener. I know they lost by one, but when you have a guy like Cam Thomas who can go for 30 plus off the bench, who you've barely played and invested in yet, that makes Brooklyn enough to be sneaky interesting to me. Portland actually made out pretty well in the Damian Lillard trade, really well in my opinion. Once they drafted Scoot Henderson, I'd been waiting for them to trade Dame ever since they drafted Scoot. I'm like, well, that has to be the indicator. Like, don't move forward acting like this is the move to keep Dame when you just used your number 2 draft pick to draft a guard, the best guard in the draft. So like that right away, I mean the night of the draft, I was like, well, okay, can we get the Dame trade now? Clearly you're moving forward. So okay, so now you've got Scoot leading the way, and you've got Anthony Simons, and Shaedon Sharpe. You've got guards there already. You drafted another guard while your superstar lead guard is where you're trying to figure out what's going on with him. So the second they said the name Scoot Henderson, I'm like, okay, then trade Dame already. So clearly you're going to trade Dame. But Portland made out really well in the Damian Lillard trade. They have a really nice guard core. Anthony Simons, he picked up things from Dame last season. He he started to really get nice. Anthony Simons is nice. Shaden Sharp is nice. Like they're not good. They're nice. You throw Scoot and what he's able to do as a rookie in there. I mean, they're going to be pretty fun to watch. Low key fun to watch. That's why they're sneaky interesting for me. Then they messed around and got DeAndre Ayton. They picked up Robert Williams III from Boston. So they've got two, one big who's like, pretty good. One big who's I mean, both bigs who are really good, and certainly serviceable, but both true big men who can do different things for you, who both protect the rim, who can do some things offensively. Like Portland made out really well. I see them as sneaky interesting, nothing more until otherwise. Detroit, sneaky interesting. I want to see Cade Cunningham, with him healthy now. I saw he had a really good opener. And I want to see Cade and Jaden Ivey and how they're working as a backcourt. Especially with Monty Williams there as the new head coach in Detroit. They have some good things going. I definitely I'm high on Cade Cunningham, and I want to see what him and Ivy can do as a backcourt. So to me, they're definitely on that sneaky interesting wave. Washington, we all know it's a pool party. Jordan Poole and Kyle Kuzma, they're kind of like a B-level star duo in the NBA, but they can score nonetheless. That is talent to have to deal with. There could be a case that they're in the doldrums, but I just feel like with a player like Jordan Poole and Kyle Kuzma, and they have other guys, they have some good players. They're going to be pretty irrelevant. They won't be good. They'll lose a lot of games. But I find them sneaky interesting, honestly, mainly because of Jordan Poole, and they're not going to be a good team. The Wizards could easily move down to doldrums or another category I'm going to get to in a second. But for now, I do have them as sneaky interesting just because they have Jordan Poole, they have Kyle Kuzma. That might make for some interesting basketball. Orlando, I've been kind of high on them the last few years, but I love Paolo. Obviously incredible rookie year. I'm really looking forward to what he does year 2. Cause his rookie year was one of those that didn't look like a rookie playing in the NBA, if you know what I mean. Like he has figured things out pretty quickly on, from a physicality standpoint, from a feel standpoint. I mean, depending how good he looks, that's what's going to make Orlando, possibly look like a playoff team. They are probably my most sneaky, interesting team, Orlando. Cole Anthony just got his extension, which I am a big fan of, even though they have 36 zillion guards on that team. I felt like because it was like RJ Hampton, they got Markelle Fultz in there, Cole Anthony, one or two other guys they've kind of circulated through the last couple years. When I would watch them, I would say Cole Anthony looks like the one they need to make sure they definitely hang on to. And I'm all for guard depth, just like I talked about with the Knicks. With Portland, with Brooklyn, I'm all for guard depth if it makes sense. So Orlando, I think they've been trying to figure that out, but I'm really glad they re-signed and extended Cole Anthony because I think he's got to be part of that equation. They have some really good skill players. Jalen Suggs, that's another one of the guards I've seen with Orlando, and I love his game too. But I think they've got to decide and invest. The biggest hole they have is on the wing, I think, and Paolo kind of fills that as a dual forward, but I think they could really use like a good traditional scoring wing or even shooting guard. But Orlando, I love the pieces they have. I think they're going to be good in the next few years. I think they have some real potential to be a legit team, but for now they're sneaky interesting to me. My low-key fascinating teams, I've got 3. San Antonio, Minnesota, and Houston. Houston, I just did my last episode was talking about Ime Udoka as the head coach of the Houston Rockets. To me, that is one of the low-key, great, fascinating storylines of the season. And I just talked about that on the last episode of the show because I think the Rockets have a playoff-worthy roster, but I think their ceiling is determined by what Ime Udoka is able to get out of them. So I find them very low-key fascinating, the Houston Rockets. San Antonio, I think it goes without saying, Victor Wembanyama. I think we're all fascinated and mesmerized by just what he can do. Doesn't really matter what the team does. The kind of impact that Wemby has on both ends of the floor is good enough to make San Antonio competitive. And that's what makes them fascinating for now, is that they have a fascinating prospect. People are really glad that we get to now find out about other players on the Spurs who are pretty good, like Devin Vassell. He's supposed to be really good. And now that I'm getting eyes on him, I'm seeing, wow, that dude is different. So Wemby is bringing, more of that attention back to San Antonio. Not just the franchise itself, but other players on the team who we may have just been overlooking or not watching because they were kind of irrelevant the last few years. But Wemby brings that fascinating factor to San Antonio. So to me, they're low-key fascinating. And then Minnesota, they're low-key fascinating. I almost had them in my next category, which will be the last one, because I wondered if they are really committed to making this Anthony Edwards team as opposed to like Karl Anthony Towns team. I mean, I think it can be both of their teams, and I think them together as a duo, committed to each other and their abilities, can really cause problems for people. I mean, everyone's high on Anthony Edwards. Everyone's high on Anthony Edwards. We all are. And Karl Anthony Towns looks really good right now, too. I think if that team's identity is really committed to that duo of Edwards and Cat, they can do something. They still have other holes. I still don't love their roster, but they have two really good players. And to me, that'll be low-key fascinating to see what Ant and Cat can do to make Minnesota relevant this season. My last category is identity crisis. I have 6 teams that I feel are under an identity crisis: the Clippers, the Sixers, the Raptors, the Hawks, the Bulls, and the Pelicans. The Clippers, they could be contenders. They could be at full strength. I consider them championship contenders. I put them in identity crisis because I feel like this season, what happens this season determines what their identity is going forward. And to me, they're on the verge of an identity crisis. And this season has to be do or die for them, in my opinion. Their one injury, if one of their guys goes down, it's like they're just, they're not going to get it done. They need everyone healthy at the right time. So if that's the case, they are championship contender worthy, no question about it. But based on the implications of the season, the fact that they have to get a return on this, like I really think this is a make or break season for the Kawhi and Paul George era. And for that reason, I see them as having being qualified for an identity crisis, because we still don't even know who they are or how good they can be because we just haven't seen it. So I think they qualify for that for now. The Sixers should go without saying. The James Harden stuff has just been a mess. And despite that, this is my big thing with Harden. Even if they had Harden like committed and even in shape, honestly, I still don't think they get. I mean, they could probably be good enough to get to the conference finals, but that roster is still flawed. It's still missing pieces. The way the roster has been set up, and I said this when they got Harden, I'm like, you guys better hope Harden is at an elite level. You have some other good players, but Philly is not, 8+ deep. They're not coming with strength and numbers like the Warriors in 2015. They're built on their 2 stars. And when you're built on your 2 stars, those 2 have to be super elite, and you need other players around them to be ready to do championship level basketball things, much like the Lakers in the bubble. AD and LeBron surrounded by guys like Rondo and Dwight Howard and players like that, right? LeBron and AD still had to be elite and great, and they were. And I don't see the Sixers as really filling out their roster with those kind of players, and they're so reliant on their 2 horses, and now one of them is down. So now they've just taken a step back. So who knows if Philly will want to take another big step back and move off Embiid at some point and regroup, just because it's just not hitting. They're not getting to championship level. I mean, Milwaukee's retooling and getting better. Miami's always Miami. Boston's retooling, revamping, getting better, constantly changing and trying to figure it out. I mean, Philly's been changing and figuring things out and kind of adjusting too, but theirs has been more of a regression, it feels like. So definitely looking at the Sixers as having an identity crisis right now. The Toronto Raptors, who I have a lot of respect for, Scotty Barnes, I'm a big fan of. Pascal Siakam, a much better player than I think people really realize right now. But I just think, Toronto, just kind of being in kind of this gray area now with the franchise. They do have a young, upcoming like potential star player in Scotty. But he's got to get there. They don't have any other like star level players. Pascal is a really good player. But they're towards the bottom of the Eastern Conference. They don't, they lost Fred. So they're lacking some heavy hitters. Always going to be a respectable franchise, in my opinion. I think like Masai, I just think really ever since, and maybe this was the case before, so not any disrespect, but like, especially since they won the title with Kawhi in 2019, it feels like that franchise just kind of gained a little more, respect. Like I think even watching them, like you still kind of sense that they expect to be, championship worthy. Like they respect themselves enough as a franchise to even aspire towards that. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what I see when I still see the Raptors. It's just that I think their identity is very much in question right now. Atlanta, I want a better running mate for Trae Young. I think he's too good to not have a star level running mate. DeJounte Murray was a nice start, a nice idea, and that's a good backcourt, but I really preferred like a Jason Tatum, like an elite level wing or an elite level big to pair with Trae Young. I just think Atlanta, like as great, I believe Trae Young is great enough. I mean, we saw him take down the Knicks in Madison Square Garden, take a bow. Like he is good enough on his, not to say he does it by himself, but he assists the ball at a higher rate than anybody. So just in terms of his production, what he can do as an offensive player to score and get others involved, Trae Young is dangerous enough of a weapon to win a playoff series, to win 2 playoff series, to get you to the big game. But he deserves better players to play with. Like he's not gonna do all that by himself. He's not gonna carry you all that way by himself. I believe he's good enough to do a lot. But you give him even a little bit more help, and things will get really dangerous for the league. And Atlanta just doesn't have it. And so I think their identity is in question. I think after this season, they're going to have to take a hard look at, I don't know what Trae's contract is looking like, but eventually he's going to have to take a hard look at his own situation. But Atlanta's going to be under pressure pretty soon because they're not going anywhere far this season unless there's something I don't know about or something that's going to happen that shakes things up. But they're not going to do anything. And Trae Young is just too talented to just be wallowing away in Atlanta like that. So identity crisis. Chicago, we all know that's an identity crisis. They had a team meeting after losing the season opener against Oklahoma City. Apparently some issues about the offense or something like that. Questions are raising about DeMar DeRozan and his future in Chicago. It sucks that the Lonzo Ball thing didn't work out for them, with him not being fully healthy yet to really run with them consistently, because I really liked the idea of a Lonzo, Zach LaVine, DeMar DeRozan situation. The Bulls, they're close to being in the Doldrums. I mean, they almost kind of live there, but I more so see them as like an identity crisis because they need, like, they have players. They have DeMar DeRozan, they have Zach LaVine, they've got players, high level players. And it's like they're close. Even Vucevic, like they've got good players. I'm not too sure about Billy Donovan. I'm not too sure about their front office management stuff, but they have players. They just don't have an identity. So to me, that's the biggest crisis for them. And lastly, the New Orleans Pelicans identity crisis. Zion, probably the biggest part of the identity crisis. The fact that he hasn't panned out yet, just health wise and conditioning wise and all that stuff. So we just haven't seen Zion at his full potential and such. We haven't seen the Pelicans reach any kind of real potential without him. It could be something if it's Zion and Brandon Ingram healthy and committed and all that. It might be something. We just don't know. So until Zion gives us a little more assurance, I'm definitely looking at the Pelicans as being in the identity crisis category. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Basketball Society podcast. This was the NBA Team Spectrum. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, if you're listening on YouTube, you can like this video. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, leave a rating and review of the show. I would really appreciate that if you would take some time to do that for us. This is the Basketball Society podcast. We'll be updating the Spectrum throughout the season, so make sure you stay tapped in for more episodes. Subscribe to the show wherever you're listening from, and I'll talk to you guys next time.